right, everybody, I'm going to try this again. See if it works. Yep, looks like I am live on all the channels this time. I want to thank you for your patience with me, and hopefully you will get something out of this reading. And let me just make sure that everything is connected and working. It's just me operating this channel, so you'll just have to bear with me. Okay, it looks like everything's in working order. So the Great Taking is a book that was written just a few months ago, or at least it was published a few months ago, and made public just a few months ago. So and one of our donors and one of our patrons actually donated the book to us, and I read through the prologue. So that's what I want to read today. But before I go into the prologue, I want to make sure that the audio levels are working well and that everybody can hear me. This is an audio only broadcast, so there will be no visuals in this discussion and in this reading, just letting you know. And also, if you have any comments you want to make on the good morning, BC, and good morning, JP. Thank you for joining. If you have any comments that you want to make while I'm talking, that's fine. I'll do my very best to read your comments as I go along. But the book, like I said, the book itself was donated by a patron to us, and it's a really important piece of work. The book itself is less than 100 pages. I'm going to read through the prologue this morning, which is about 13 pages. And it's a pretty in-depth read. And even if some of the concepts and some of the material is, above your head, a lot of it's above my head, so don't feel bad. Just listen anyway, because at some point it will all come together. And what I'm hoping to do is read a few passages every week until the book is finished. And it shouldn't take too long because it's only less than 100 pages. So we've all heard of Catherine Austin Fitts. We've all heard of Edward Dowd. To be honest with you, I think Mr. David Rogers Webb blows them, out of the water. Like, I think that he is far advanced and far beyond their understanding of the financial sort of wizardry or the strange financial situation we find ourselves in this country. So one of the things I thought was really interesting was the name of the book, The Great Taking. There have been times over the last few years, as we were all experiencing what has been labeled as the Great Reset, and what I often call the COVID operation. There have been times when I've even announced publicly through these broadcasts, or I've announced privately to friends or family or JP, it feels more like a great taking. And so when this book was gifted to me over a week ago, and it was in the mail, and I opened it up, I thought, wow, was somebody listening to me? Because it really is a great taking. It takes your relationships. So what's happening is the institutions at play here, not just financial institutions, but every powerful entity at play, they're taking relationships. So your relationships with your families have been kind of altered over these last few years. I would say over these last few decades, probably starting with the 9/11 event. Your relationship with how you earn an income is changed. Uh, your relationship with how you even function in the world is changing. It feels like things are just being depleted. Or at one time back in 2016 or so, JP was having trouble finding work, and he looked at me and said, "It feels like I'm being compressed, like we're all being pushed down." And that's exactly what's happening. So before I start reading the prologue, I want to talk a little bit about a personal, um, our personal voyage, our personal discovery about these, corrupted, systemically corrupted uh, institutions and the way that the world operates. So I met JP in 2012. He was gainfully employed. Within 2 years, he had been fired. And ever since that point, he was having a hard time finding a job. He was doing contract work, which is basically like you just sign up with a recruiter and they put you on various jobs. And his field is UX design. So, and for me, I had been working, at Le Cordon Bleu for 5 years. The entire institution across the United States had collapsed through various, wrongdoing, that the institution had been engaged in, as far as, how they were making money, where they were putting the money, things like that. And I never really went back to the corporate sector after that. And so that was in around 2012, 2013 or so. So what happened was, we were in this relationship. We had decided to get married, but JP was not employed and neither was I. So things were really tough. And we were living in San Francisco, one of the most expensive cities in the country. And even though the apartment we were living in was rent controlled, it still was, it was more than what we could afford, not having any real income or any real means of survival. So there was a little bit of money in a retirement account, a very small amount of money in a retirement account. We used that money to buy a house with cash. Um, and so we went into this, situation understanding that we were leaving, one of the most beautiful cities in the world and living this really lovely life, to moving into a situation where it would be a hard life and it would be a difficult life and a life full of challenges and at times maybe even regret. But I never looked at it um, as a regretful decision. I always looked at it as an opportunity to turn this decision where we left something beautiful and had to move to something that was really, really challenging and quite ugly, to something that would then parlay us into another better situation. So we bought this house for the price of a used car in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, specifically McKees Rocks. And for the next 5 years, we developed a plan, or I developed a plan in 2018 when we moved there as a married couple now. We got married in 2017. I developed a plan in 2018 saying the house is wonderful. The house is great. The house is a wonderful gift. It's good bones. It's almost 100 years old. It's a beautiful structure. It will serve us well. And of course, JP, being who he is and a designer, made it a wonderful place for us to experience the great taking, the great reset, the COVID operation, because here we were in a community of derelict, in a community of poverty, a community where our neighbors, wear ankle monitors, where there's drug addicts everywhere, where there's fighting and gunshots and trauma. The little tiny itty bitty little local newspaper couldn't even continue to go. They had to shut down. Um, so we saw, the troubled community that we had moved to, um, because we had no choice. And so this is the also, the narrative that nobody's really explaining. Nobody's really being transparent about the lack of choice in the United States, citizenry, these people that get up and go to work and work hard and work long hours and sometimes work 1, 2, or 3 jobs in order to provide for their family. Um, it's, this is not a sustainable system. Even just with that, having to work 3 jobs, that's not a sustainable system, right? So now we've got a situation where it doesn't matter what you do, the system is in full on collapse financially, in as far as your community goes, as far as your worldview goes, everything is in complete collapse. That's why it's really a great taking. And I'm so glad that Mr. Webb wrote this book and used this title, because it is a term that I have used in the past, and I'm really happy to see it published. So the as the story goes, as you all know, as some of you know, some of you don't, we lived in this neighborhood of deep poverty, and we watched it sort of eat itself alive over the next 5 years. And we knew that the system was in serious collapse. And most people in neighborhoods of poverty understand that concept. If you were to try to tell your gainfully employed or lucratively employed friends or family member about a collapsed system that is based on a complete fabrication and a complete lie, um, they won't they won't respond. They won't accept that. They won't understand it. They can't conceive of it, right? So we left in, we decided to, if we were going to have to live in a collapsed system, we did not want to live in the community that we were in. We wanted to live somewhere beautiful, somewhere that would be better for my health, because I have autoimmune issues, and the snow and all the stairs in my home were really disintegrating my health rapidly. So we left McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Pittsburgh, and we moved to the Gulf Coast. And it's much better. It's much more pleasant, but we knew that we would be taking a big financial risk to do so. So those financial risks are not something that we allow to manipulate our behavior or our attitude towards the world around us. We don't live in a place of fear. There has never been a fear-based foundation of the way we live our life. I look at a budget every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, and I calculate whether I can help that family that was burned out of their home down the street from us, or whether I can afford to buy something and spend a little bit more money to buy something at a local market, as opposed to, say, going to Target or Walmart. These are the decisions every day that I make. Can I do this? Can I not do this? What can I afford to make myself happy and comfortable? Um, and it's not based on fear. It's actually based on something called abundance. It's based on charity. It's based on those very, like, those things that you learned when you were in Bible school at age 5, be charitable, be kind, be good, and give to people in need. And so that's how we've lived our lives. And we have found that despite, our own financial constraints, that if we've decided that we want to help somebody, and even if our budget says, no, 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 red flag, don't do it, we do it anyway. And one of the things that helps us, move along into this story of abundance and into this place of charity and goodness is that we make plans. We have 5-year plans. We don't live on social media, and we don't allow the fear narratives that tend to percolate through your favorite podcasters to corporate media and all that stuff, and the so-called experts in their field. We don't allow that fear narrative to get into our subconscious or into our consciousness at all. Our new house here in the Gulf Coast actually has um, cinder block walls, and so and that those cinder block walls have kept things like Katrina and various other storms from sweeping this house away. Those cinder block walls, and so that's how we operate, in the world through our behavior. Through our consciousness, as we hold up the cinder block walls and block all of the narrative that would create fear. Every single thing that is fear-based leaves our worldview, it leaves our mind, and it leaves our hearts, it leaves the way we live our life. There is no room for it. It does not manifest. It does not appear. I want to tell you about a dream I had last night. It was a dream about a former lawyer that I used to work for back in like 2000 and oh wait. Oh, I was at this law firm when 9/11 actually took place. So I started working there probably in 1999 or so, and then was there for about 3 years. So during 9/11 is when I was at this law firm, or the other way around. I was at this law firm while 9/11 took place. Um, so I had a dream about one of the lawyers I worked for. And I'll just say his name was Henry. I won't give you his last name, but he's very wealthy. And he has a beautiful home in a neighborhood in San Francisco called Seacliff, which is where Winona Ryder has purchased a home. Robin Williams had a home in Seacliff. Many billionaires live in Seacliff. It's a stunning neighborhood. It's absolutely beautiful, with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge, view of the sea. I mean, it's called Seacliff, right? So he lived out in Seacliff, but my dream was that he had called me on the phone, and he said to me, "I received a letter in the mail and I need you to help me translate it or transcribe it." And I said, "Okay, well, what do you need?" And the dream was so clear cut. You know how dreams are sometimes, just kind of this amalgamation of chaos, and things don't make sense, and it's kind of all over the place and you have a hard time remembering it. Well, this dream was very clear. In the letter, it stated that his home could not be used as collateral to pay off his debt, and that his descendants, not his inheritors like his son or his grandchildren or people that would inherit his wealth, that he would leave his money to, that his descendants, this was such a biblical term. You only hear this term in the Bible or things like that, but that his descendants would not benefit from his wealth. They would be impoverished. They would be enslaved to his debt, despite the fact that he had this beautiful home. And I was explaining to him, you cannot sell your home. The letter is telling you that you cannot sell your home in order to pay off your debt, that you can't do it, that the whole system is collapsed and everything is different now. And he was in great distress. And he said that his mother had actually received the letter. So it basically told me when I woke up that his mom, this man is probably in his 70s right now. And so that means his mother, who's probably long dead, that this system of collapse goes all the way back to her time and the time before. And that what we are inheriting is poverty. What we are inheriting is a joyless existence. What we are inheriting is trauma. And I saw that firsthand in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania. I saw that firsthand, where an inheritance of poverty and being forced into programs which don't benefit anyone, and just this decrepit existence where houses were condemned and falling around all around me, and big giant sinkholes in front of my own home. And unlike the house I live in now, which has the cinder blocks that do protect us from the weather, there was nothing to protect us from this corrupted system that goes all the way back, beyond your parents, your grandparents' generation. Okay, so one of the things I like about the author of this book is that he grew up, I guess he grew up in Cleveland, and he witnessed with his own eyes the degradation and the destruction from within, of that town as well, of Cleveland. And so he, as a child, he knew that it wasn't right. He knew that watching his parents struggle and watching families that were well off suddenly become so poor they had no money, watching all of these beautiful homes, these magnificent homes turn into, just turn to rot right before his eyes. So even as a child, he knew that something was wrong. So he decided to look into the way the global financial system works beyond our borders, beyond. And so that's what really struck me about him, is that as a child, he knew it wasn't right. And so he spent his life's work trying to understand why the system would do it to people who work hard, people who pay their taxes, and people who contribute to the local economy and support one another. So he's not a big social media person. Um, and BC makes a really good point. And thank you, Natasha. Cinder block walls, exactly what a metaphor. BC makes a good point. I always wondered why the future was always pictured as dystopian in just about all media growing up. Well, according to the people who are manipulating this and corrupting this from the inside out, it it can be. But if you don't live in fear and you don't live in that place of, sort of like miserly, like holding on to your own because of what's happening, you're afraid you'll lose it any minute. But if you live in a place of abundance in your mind and in your heart, we gave more money away over the last few years than I've probably given in my lifetime. And I'm happy to do it. There was somebody who I've never even met. Her boyfriend was attacked for some reason. This was a couple of years ago. They had no insurance and his leg was shattered. So I spent the day talking to her on the phone and trying to figure out exactly what the problems were. The bone was not fusing, and I purchased hundreds of dollars worth of bone growth systems and supplements and nutrients for him to take, and I just gave it away. A couple of weeks ago, on Christmas Eve, actually, here in the Gulf Coast, a family with 4 small children was burned out of their home without any question, without even, blinking an eye. We handed them a, a sizable amount of money. I'm not saying this to brag about, oh, we're doing this, we're doing that. I'm saying this is that we are not in a position, if you look at us on paper, we are definitely not in a position to be doing that, but we're doing it anyway. And that's what I'm saying, is that the entire collapsing of this financial system, which I promise I will read the prologue of the book in 1 minute. I appreciate you listening to this. Despite all of that, we're ignoring it and we're continuing to do the right thing. The financial corrupted, collapsed system hates that. It really, really bugs them when people continue to do the right thing, whether they can afford it or not. And that's, and that's what I'm saying, is that you have to behave as if it doesn't even exist. And I do encourage moving more and more off of social media and getting out into your community and seeing where the need is and meeting that need in any way you can. We don't have a lot of time. Our time is eaten up by, just we're working on, fixing up the house, and getting it to a stage that we feel comfortable. This means running around a lot to different hardware stores. JP has a full-time job that is 40 plus hours a week. So we don't have a lot of time to give. So we don't overextend ourselves. And so that's important, that you don't do a thing that will overextend you. But even though on paper it may not look like we can really afford to be donating, we do it anyway because it's what we feel that we can do. All right. So the thing that I found incredibly endearing about the author of this book is that he said after the 9/11 collapse, after the 9/11 event, he realized over a span of, a couple of years that the system was so deeply corrupted and that the financial system was basically working on, you know, just wizardry, and it just made no sense. And he tried to tell people in positions that could change it, his neighbors, his friends, people he'd worked with over the years, in the financial sector. This is what's happening. But he realized that their eyes and ears are closed to what he has to say, um, and that he could not break through and he could not reach them. And how many times over the past few years have each and every one of us tried so hard to reach our loved ones, and we just can't reach them, and they will not receive the information that you're giving. He realized that, with deep sorrow, he realized that the very people that could turn this thing around and fix it were the very people that he could never reach. So he decided to go into the communities of poverty and tell the story of the great taking. And you know what the communities of poverty said, basically? Tell me something I don't know. Okay, so this is where it's important that you pay attention to what's happening to the forgotten, to the people who are dying on the street, and to the homeless, because they have the knowledge that you don't have, having lived in privilege. Okay, you don't have to be afraid that you will wind up that way, but just treat them with the kind of care and respect and dignity that they deserve, because they know what the system is capable of. Okay, so I'm going to start reading. I've got about 30 minutes left, and this is only going to be the prologue, which is 13 pages. Okay, so he starts out by quoting Aeschylus, the writer of Prometheus Bound. I cannot, or excuse me, I count false words the foulest plague of all. I count false words the foulest plague of all. If you prefer, consider this a work of fiction or the ravings of a madman. Perhaps I am crazy. I know that you will not hear what I am struggling to tell you. Not yet. But perhaps as things unfold, this writing will offer some explanation of what is happening. In my mind, as I write this, is the small hope that my children might one day come to understand me a little and perhaps forgive me for being who I have been. It has been unavoidable for me to see and know about unpleasant things, which are now becoming manifest. Presently, as we all know, families are divided. People are experiencing a kind of isolation, perhaps not physically, but in spirit and mind. This has been made to happen through the dark magic of false news and narrative. This alone has been a great crime against humanity. The tactical purposes are many: to confuse and divide, to cause disengagement, to demoralize, to instill fears, and to introduce false focal points for these fears, to manipulate the historical narrative, to create a false sense of the present reality, and ultimately to cause people to acquiesce to what has been planned. Facing this onslaught, how can anyone know anything? Direct knowledge acquired through one's own experience and the personal experiences of others may be used to pierce these false narratives. Living memory contains clues. What has been done before can be done again. If exposure of the personal history in this prologue grows tedious, please go to the meat of the matter in the chapters ahead. But if you will continue reading here, perhaps you might discover that I am a human being like you. Perhaps it will be of some use to you to know that I have worked a lifetime to understand the forces hurting us. For me, being known has never been a wise or desirable objective, unless it has been to accomplish some essential purpose. And now my purpose is this. It is so that what I am trying to tell you might be heard and understood. We are in danger, and so I will risk telling you my personal story. How have I come to know what I am trying to tell you? I am old enough to remember the JFK assassination. I was sitting in the little basket in the front of a shopping cart at Fazio's grocery store on Lee Road when the announcement was made over the speaker. A woman standing nearby burst into tears. Within a few years of the assassination, we were living the industrial collapse of the U.S. For a boy in a family of engineers in the crane and hoist business in Cleveland, the years ahead would be very much like living through the Great Depression. In the summer of 1966, a portion of the city was burned in the Hough riots. I believe that's how it's pronounced, Hough. The National Guard was called in and placed machine gun nests on roofs. On top of the riots, little Webb equipment was being targeted by the Teamsters Union. So Webb Equipment was the name of his family's business. His last name is Webb. Windshields were smashed with baseball bats. Due to the threat of Molotov cocktails, records were moved out of the office and roofs were hosed down at night. It was like living in a war zone, and it was going to get much worse. There could never be a recovery. There would be complete destruction of everything we had known. Our extended family had been benevolent, close, and happy. In just a few years, death consumed the entire older generation and some of the next. The patriarch, Grandpa Webb, died at age 79. The following year, my father's older brother died of a heart attack at age 51. As a young man, he had been captain of the Case Western Reserve wrestling team and looked something like a god. He had left a successful career at Alcoa to help his aging father in business, as had my father. Shortly before his death, he confided in his wife of struggling to keep the men employed, bidding for contracts near cost. He was a man who cared deeply and felt responsibly, keenly. However improbable it seems now, Cleveland had been one of the most vital industrial centers of the world. In the 19th and 20th century, it was like all of industrial America in one city. I remember reading that at one point, the Cuyahoga Valley was producing 2% of the world's industrial product. The early days of the iron, steel, aluminum, chemical, automotive, aeronautics, and oil industries were all in Cleveland. Standard Oil was formed there. Rockefeller's first refinery was there. John D. is buried in Lakeview Cemetery, as are both sides of my family who were descended from early English settlers. One of these forebears had arrived with the first settlement in Jamestown and Plymouth. William Bradford was an ancestor. The Webbs had common ancestry with John Adams, Samuel Adams, and John Quincy Adams. We had Masonic swords and little statues of Washington and Franklin dressed in their Masonic regalia. Dad, his brother, and their father and grandfather had been Masons. Despite this, it seems they did not get the memo about what was coming. By the early 1970s, the family business, which had once had 80 men in the shop, was down to one, Ladislaw Horvath, earlier known as Little Laddie, being the son of the elder of the same name who had worked for my grandfather. Laddie, who had been a helicopter mechanic in Vietnam and could do absolutely everything, later told me that he had thought he would go crazy, there having been absolutely nothing even for him to do. The business activity had gone to zero. Under extremely difficult and worsening circumstances, my father had been left without the support of his father and brother, but with full responsibility for everything, which he never wanted. Stress was slowly killing him. He developed chronic asthma, became depressed and angry, and often stayed in bed. Sometimes, after my uncle's death, my older brother nearly lost several fingers in the lawnmower. Dad then gave me the job of cutting the lawn. I was happy and proud to be entrusted with such a big job, as indeed it was. I was 9 years old. In the years ahead, I discovered that something in my father necessitated that I be put to work under increasingly unpleasant and even dangerous circumstances. When I was 12, I became seriously ill after being pressed to work when I was already ill. By 13, I was the low man on the totem pole at the shop, as described by one of the guys at my father's funeral. It was hot, dirty, and sometimes quite dangerous. I could easily have lost fingers, my eyesight, or worse. Excelling in school remained a given, but hard labor marked the remainder of my boyhood. I recall being tasked with sifting dirt from a gravel pile in the full summer sun and humidity. I was to then use the dirt to fill holes where I had pulled weeds. I was hard at work when Dad came home. Saying nothing, he kicked over the wheelbarrow and threw tools as far as he could. There were tears in his eyes. Knowing that I had done nothing wrong, I don't think I felt afraid so much as something else. It was my father who was in some kind of trouble. I saw him. I think what I felt was an intense need to understand what was happening and why. And so, even though Dad was hard on me, I was perhaps the only person intensely interested in what he had to say. It was the silence and not having things explained that got to me the most. And so I asked questions. He was an intelligent guy, and he had filled his room with stacks and stacks of books. He was trying to understand what was happening, and so was I. Consequently, by the age of 12, I had become a student of the Great Depression and of the mysteries of the Federal Reserve, also known as the Fed. I knew that the Federal Reserve System had been secretly planned at a meeting on Jekyll Island, and that gold owned by the public had been confiscated in the Depression, and that Nixon had recently taken the dollar off the gold standard. Coincidentally, Dad had also been 12 at a traumatic age when, in March of 1933, they closed the banks and confiscated gold. He was named for his maternal grandfather, who, in the weeks before the panic of 1907, the crisis atmosphere of which was used to justify the creation of the Federal Reserve System, had been shot from behind in the neck in the middle of the night on the staircase of his home near Euclid Avenue. The murder was never solved. While it had been mentioned in newspapers from New York to Alaska at the time, the history had been kept from my father. Dad went down to the public library and dug into microfiche of these old articles, which he copied. He showed me a shoebox full of them. His grandfather was described as a wealthy coal operator. I've seen records of his accumulation and sale in 1905 of coal rights on more than 800 acres in Mahoning County, having retained rights to drill through the coal seam for oil, which his descendants theoretically have still. Dad was interested in what had happened on Jekyll Island, so much so that we drove there. I have the postcard with a 1960s era photograph of a large white building and the inscription, "The Clubhouse," with the further explanation on the obverse. The clubhouse was the heart of interest of the Jekyll Island, Georgia Club during the years 1886 to 1942. This was the most exclusive club in America, known as the Club of Millionaires. Such illustrious names as Astor, Vanderbilt, Morgan, Rockefeller, Baker, and others were found among the club roster. Paul Warburg, a member of the most prominent and ancient German banking family, had led the meeting on Jekyll Island in which the Federal Reserve was planned. He later openly acknowledged that this had been done in secret. Also at that meeting was Colonel Edward M. House, who in subsequent years laid the groundwork for the establishment of the Council on Foreign Relations. In the quiet of Christmas Eve, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. The Great War followed by just 7 months. Despite boyhood years of trauma, and perhaps because of them, I went on to do some things. Early childhood formation had saved me from being crushed. This was largely thanks to Grandma Rogers, my mother's mother. She was a Montessori school. By the age of 3, I was sharpening knives and making tea. At night, she sat by my bedside, helping me drift off to sleep. She spoke softly in the darkness, remembering things to me from her childhood and from the Great War. I realized only as an adult that they had been warnings. She had gone with my grandfather into the Great War. She as a nurse and he as a surgeon. They were not yet married. The U.S. had not yet entered the war. The field hospital in Rouen had 3,000 beds, but the casualties were more than this each day. Even the cooks were attending to the wounded. In the darkness, at my bedside, she recalled the sound of the big guns and the shells exploding, which she could hear from the hospital tents. She and my grandfather were married after the war and honeymooned in Quebec City. They were the same age, 38. She had her first child, my mother, at age 42. To have come through so much, to marry and to have children, it must have seemed a miracle. Grandpa Rogers was named for a cousin who had joined the army to get away from working in his father's shoe store. He ended up at Little Bighorn. Grandpa's grandfather, born in 1816, had also been a surgeon. As a boy, I was allowed to handle his grandfather's surgical kit. It is identical to the one in the Gettysburg Museum. Grandpa's great uncle is buried there. He was a cavalry officer, surviving 50 engagements, captured when his horse was shot in the head. He later escaped through a swamp, pursued by hounds from a Confederate prison where the men were dying of starvation and smallpox. My grandfather taught surgery after the war until his untimely death in 1945. We had a chair in the house that someone had given to him. It was explained to me that in the Great Depression, he did surgeries without payment because no one had money. They had a Dutchman living on the third floor of the house. He had lost his job with the factory closures and simply had nowhere else to go. I liked Grandma and often visited her room. She had been born on the Canadian side of the lake in 1883. She told me about riding in a sleigh wrapped in buffalo robes with bricks warmed in the fireplace under her feet. She had a picture of Queen Elizabeth on the wall in her room. With the Lakeside unit, she and Grandpa had met King George and Queen Mary in a reception at Buckingham Palace. I learned about that from a newspaper I found among her things. She somehow conveyed to a small boy that medicine is a profession as distinguished from pursuits for one's own purposes, and that in the original sense of the word, business is not a profession. I struggled with this last bit for some time, as my dad's family was clearly in business. Nevertheless, I understood that one's work should be about something more than making money. I was welcome in her room. One day I wandered in as she was getting out of the bathtub. I wondered at the wrinkles. She was unperturbed, completely natural, having a quiet dignity at all times. She died of a series of strokes when I was 7. I did not understand death. Half a century later, I came to understand that I had lost then the best friend I would ever have. I would have gladly followed the certainty she had given me that I should become a physician, as did my brother. However, in the remaining years of my boyhood, the way before me became not only uncertain, it became the unknown. I did not know how to do it, but I needed to somehow understand and get control over what was destroying our lives. I had accepted the burden of my father. We lived in East Cleveland, which was crumbling due to the loss of its industrial base. At about the time of my uncle's death, my older brother and his friends playing baseball in Forest Hill Park, which is a former Rockefeller estate, were surrounded by a huge crowd, beaten up, and had their bicycles and baseball mitts stolen. My father reacted to this by pulling him out of the local public school and sending him to a private school. While moving out of East Cleveland was considered, it was not undertaken. So, as conditions worsened further, I eventually followed to the same private school some years later. But by this time, the financial resources of the family were running thin. Each summer, the uncertainty of whether I would return to school was obliquely made known to me. Being told about bad things did not bother me so much as not being told. I needed to know. The silence was terrible. Life is more difficult if people can't talk. Things go undiscovered or misunderstood. If it is possible to talk, outcomes might be changed. The future might be shaped for the better. The summer before my senior year was particularly uncertain. My mother told me that my dad would not apply for financial assistance. I had no idea if I would be returning to school, but at the end of the summer, I started back to football practice, as no one told me I couldn't. I delivered newspapers before school, worked as a busboy at night and as a janitor on weekends, drove a delivery truck, and painted houses. I was reading business books and missing no opportunities. Managed to set up an internship in market research at a Fortune 500 company. Many years later, after my mother's death, I found a copy of the letter she had sent to the school, which had apparently secured my final year. Perhaps due to some embarrassment, this had never been explained to me. Without Mom, I might have suddenly had no recourse but to complete high school in East Cleveland, which was then quite ahead of the times. They already had police and metal detectors in the hallways. When I told my father that I was interested in studying business, he told me that this would not prepare me to do anything and that I should study engineering. I had, however, observed that the engineers in our family hadn't seemed to fare so well. And so, against my father's advice, I chose to attend a state business school studying finance and computer science. In my mind, these pursuits were dignified with the idea that business is the science of meeting unmet human needs, and that this can only be done sustainably if it is done profitably. It later came as a difficult realization for me that people in business have no greater purpose than making money. Nothing else comes to that except perhaps being important and sexual escapades. I was an outlier. I was extremely focused on pursuing things I sensed I needed to understand. This gave me an advantage. I would come to know things that others did not know. Coming from a family of engineers and medical people, I then knew nothing about the world of high finance and had no one to guide me. I invested in a subscription to the Wall Street Journal, which in those days was actually a factual business publication. Sometimes I forced myself to go through a stack of them, page by page. I noticed the tombstones published to announce major deals. These were somehow important. The firms involved were in New York for the most part, and so I knew I needed to go there. So I'm still in the prologue, and we're coming up on the 1 hour mark. So what I'm going to do is continue this at the next reading, because as I said, the prologue is about 13 pages, and there's still quite a few pages to go. So I will go ahead and mark it, and then we'll pick it up next time. But I want to end this broadcast by thanking everybody who has joined. Tell your friends, tell the people you're connected to on social media, tell your followers about the Great Taking. You can find a video about it on YouTube. It's a little over an hour long. If you can follow David Rogers Webb somehow, I would recommend doing it. And just, be open to this idea that as we live in this continued collapse, to not to fall into despair. I think that's what's the most important thing. Fall into a place of charity and abundance, fall into a place of love. Give, if you're not sure if you should give something to someone, even if it's your time or, compassion or money, do it anyway. Teach yourself some new habits as we are navigating this incredibly disastrous financial situation that we are in. And you may not see it in front of you, but it's happening on the back end. And we're in free fall right now. So let's, try to move forward and help each other out as much as we can. And until next time, I'll continue with the prologue, which is quite fascinating. The history of this man is incredible. So I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.